Hello, 141ers. I'll see you at 1 o'clock today. I'll have some questions for you to talk about at 1. If you haven't watched this, I'll ask you to go watch it and then come back at 1:25. So if that's you, don't worry about it. But the only thing I want to talk about today, because I'll leave the rest of the tax, I'll talk about the tax a tiny bit. The main learning outcome for today is to talk about something called the farm problem. And the farm problem doesn't mean that there's always a fence to fix. It has something to do with demand for food products and how you as an individual component of a perfectly competitive market are somewhat at the mercy of the market. So I'll reiterate, our goal today, or our learning outcome, is to understand the farm problem. Oops. Okay. So the farm problem is something that you've actually probably heard of, except you probably didn't think about it from a market standpoint or didn't have it discussed that way. The way to have the best year possible in farming is for everybody else to have a terrible year and for you to have a great year. So let's look and see what that means from a market standpoint. So let's look at an individual market, and we will make that a very generic market. My slopes of supply and demand, which will mean something here in a little bit, are just 45 degrees. There's not much going on. And when I say the best way to have a good year is for everyone else to have a bad year and you have a good year, what does bad year and good year mean in farming? Typically, if we're talking about crop production, we're talking about yield. And some yield is based on the decisions that the producer makes. What are our seeding rates? Are we going to irrigate? How much fertilizer are we going to use? But a lot of it has to do with, well, what were weather conditions like? What was natural moisture? How hot was it, and how was it hot? And let's say that, or other things, there's strong storms, there's widespread hail and strong winds that knocks crops over. Let's say that there are those bad conditions. There's drought, there's high wind, there's pests, and somehow you avoid those things. So what does that look like? Well, we have this overall market, and none of those things that we're talking about are demand issues. Think about someone eating cornflakes or someone eating a hamburger. Does a storm in the middle of Nebraska have anything to do with their demand? Not a bit. These are all supply issues. And those things would be what we would call supply shocks. They're a bad thing that happens to the producer, and that decreases supply. And that should be something that you can grasp. Why does it decrease supply? Well, we've planted expecting 200 bushels per acre, but 20% of our fields were zeros. So what happens to our overall yield? It goes from 200 to 140 bushels per acre. Supply decreases, and that puts upward pressure on prices, meaning that commodity prices have gone up. So while there was a bad year for everyone, and they didn't have as much product to sell, commodity prices went up. So how does that work for the individual? Through their supply curve is called that marginal cost curve, and nothing happened to it. Their supply curve didn't shift, it stayed the same. And their marginal revenue curve that they had anticipated would be here. And this is, it's theoretical, but you're making a decision based on, hey, I think corn is going to be $3.50 a bushel. So I'm going to plan in such a manner that I'm going to have a yield of somewhere around 200 bushels per acre. And I think that this is going to be the difference between the marginal revenue of each bushel and the marginal cost. This is some type of profit contribution. and it's okay to just think about it as profit. That's a little bit not misleading, but it's not addressing fixed costs. We don't have an average total cost curve in here, but this is okay. But then everybody had a bad year, and the price of corn goes up $2. Now, maybe you didn't understand that it was going to go up to $5, and so you don't make this little chunk of profit, but this is all additional profit. And it's because everybody else had their crops knocked over and hailstorms and bugs, and you didn't. That's the way to have a great year. So this lecture is not about how do you make sure everybody else has a bad year and you have a good year. A little bit when we move on into farm management for a lot of you is about how to make these types of scenarios happen more often or to avoid the downfalls of supply shocks. But instead, this gives a better understanding of, boy, if you're a farmer, you're left to the mercy of markets and left to the mercy of exogenous or outside factors. And there's one more thing that makes that even more impactful. And that's the nature of the demand curve for farm products, excuse me. And I can generalize that even more. I can say food. And I put quotes in there because the food can be for you or me, or it can be food to feed an animal. And the demand for that food looks more like this than it does like this. Now, if we look at these two markets, or these two demand curves, this demand curve is steep, and this demand curve is not steep. And they're still demand curves. They still have an inverse relationship between price and quantity, but one of them has a much stronger relationship. We don't think about this being a strong relationship, but it is. A small change in price corresponds to a big change in quantity, whereas this demand curve is not responsive to changes in price. And I can make it even more so if this demand curve is really steep. If corn prices are $5.50 or they're $3.50, the change in quantity is just this little tiny bit. And think about, all right, it's not corn, it is ketchup. Pick ketchup on purpose. My wife just left. She's going to the store for our one time for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And I said, whatever you do, don't forget ketchup, because I like ketchup and we're out. This is saying if ketchup is expensive, you buy some, and if it's cheap, you buy more, but not much more. And think about why that might be. You aren't going to say, oh, ketchup's on sale. Let's buy as much ketchup as we can. And let's have ketchup sandwiches and ketchup milkshakes and ketchup salad. And no, you use ketchup when you eat fries, hamburgers, hot dogs. If you're me, mac and cheese, eggs, a lot of other things. I'm weird. You already knew that. But the price of ketchup changing doesn't change the quantity that I demand much. It changes some, but not much. So we have to just keep that in mind, that the law of demand is still true, but it doesn't change much. So if we look at an overall market, say, all right, let's go back to corn and say the market for corn has this steep demand curve, but the supply curve is more normal. If supply increases, well, before we show supply increasing, the price we know is determined by the intersection of supply and demand, where the market clears. And we have this quantity, Q star. Total revenue is equal to price times quantity. So if I take the price times the quantity, that means that this rectangle, we'll call it A, B, C, D, total revenue equals A, B, C, D, and that's how big it is. And how big it is a direct relationship to how much total revenue there is. If we have a good year and supply increases to S prime, my new total revenue, we'll call this E, F, C, G, E, F, C, G, this one, this rectangle is much smaller than this one. And this is how I know. When our quantity increases to Q1, here, the price goes down. So we lose this amount of revenue. But we gain this little sliver because we're selling more. So in my total revenue equation, so my total revenue the second time, the price goes down, but the quantity goes up. Well, the price goes down for everything that we're producing, and the quantity that goes up, sure, we sell more, but not enough to offset the lowering of the price. Because the price went down didn't cause consumers to want a whole lot more corn, because demand just isn't responsive to changes in price. And let's think about why that is. Ketchup maybe wasn't the best example. It's something that I think is going to be pretty unique or individual for each one of you. You can only eat so much. I think that's one of the main reasons why demand is really pretty vertical. We call that inelastic. That's what a topic of one of our future chapters is all about. And it just means that, hey, the law of demand is true, but because we can only eat so much, we're limited to how much we're going to buy. And in the case of a commodity market like corn, cows can only eat so much. And sure, livestock production can ramp up because the price of corn has gone down, and beef producers are going to say, hey, my input has gotten cheaper, I'm going to produce more livestock. But that can't happen immediately. Demand can't ramp up right away. So we're left with this issue of, if everybody has a good year, you included, your revenue is going to fall by quite a bit. And in fact, it's probably going to fall by more than your expenses. And you're going to end up with a profit that is being shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And we can see that looking at the individual. If the individual producer has marginal cost or a supply curve that looks like that, and marginal revenue that's here, if that market shift happens, that their supply increases, that's all fine and good, except for the fact that marginal revenue may really fall. In which case, the profit contribution was this wedge, highlighted here. This would have been profit contribution before, whereas now our profit contribution is this much smaller sliver. So that, in a nutshell, is an economic analysis of the farm problem, and that's if everybody has a good year, prices are going to fall by far more than yields increase, and we're going to be left with lower incomes and profit. Okay, I'll see you at 1 o'clock, and we'll go from there.